Okay,
Yeah.
so what we've done, we've kind of set the context. Now, as we move forward, I want to read some quotes so you can actually see these thinkers say this stuff for themselves.
Cool.
But I also want to move through, thanks to Todd McGowan's lecture again for giving this kind of blueprint to discuss these things.
One thing before you do dive into your quotes,
Okay.
I just want to. So we've spent a lot of time here, like kind of laying out the difference between pleasure and jouissance, and that's kind of where we're at so far. People just joining the stream, you can go to my personal site and then drag it backwards and then fast forward if you want to catch up on any of that. But the main topic is death drive, and death drive like is not just jouissance; it's related to it. We're about to get into this a lot deeper, but also I just wanted to kind of say, like, in the midst of a global pandemic and a national string of protests rising up, there's a lot of pressure building all around for everybody. We live in a lot of intensities today, and death drive can really, really take over. Like, what we're talking about is something that's very, very fucking real. And if as we go further, it doesn't really like resonate, like it, then maybe it's never truly just consumed you yet. But what's the LACAN says it starts with a
No, it's so funny you mentioned it because that's exactly the quote. It's the one that I forgot to get, and we'll read it right here. So,
Okay.
This is his famous quote about jouissance. He says, "It begins with a tickle and ends in a blaze of patrol. That's always what jouissance is. A blaze of patrol is like a huge explosion, right? But it begins with a tickle." And so it's that quote from Prometheus, big things have small beginnings. So this kind of like tapping into jouissance, right? It's usually not that big of a deal, the first instance, but it can just go from 0 to 100 like that. And he's talking about how jouissance can just consume us in certain situations, and it's like a rapid snowball effect. It's almost just like this impulse to just like explode into a blaze of glory, right? Like, I feel like a lot of times classic heavy metal conveys this really well, that kind of music.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, but it's always this back and forth between the two. So I want to read these quotes. These are kind of some of the bare essentials to see what we've said so far. So, again, pleasure principle. In Seminar 7, LACAN says, "The pleasure principle is presented to us as possessing a mode of operation which is precisely to avoid excess, too much pleasure." Now, again, this is where you get into the terminological problem, because it's like he just said pleasure principle seeking to avoid too much pleasure, but he means jouissance. Excessive excitation is what he means by too much pleasure. So the pleasure principle is always trying to avoid the too much sensation, too much stimulation, too much excitation, i.e. jouissance. And so Zizek says in Ticklish Subject, "One should never forget that, for LACAN, the Oedipal paternal law is ultimately in the service of the pleasure principle. It is the agency of pacification/normalization which, far from disturbing the balance of pleasure, stabilizes the impossible, bringing about the minimal condition for the tolerable coexistence of subjects." Right? So there we get something more, right? He's saying that when he says the Oedipal paternal law, this is one of the ways that certain leftists don't like Zizek, but Lacanian thinkers are going to say there is definitely a role for the paternal function. Now, let's be very clear. It doesn't mean any kind of like toxic masculinity. It doesn't mean. Here's the thing. For Lacan, the lawgiver, the quote father, can be a biological woman, right? Can be a woman. So it's not so much getting into gender essentialism or anything like that. What the Oedipal paternal law really means is just a kind of forceful limitations being put on our excessive enjoyment. And that's part of what we actually see a lot of people suffering from now. Is it's almost as if there's too much enjoyment in their lives. There's too much stimulation, and Zizek thinks that this is part of the problem because we are this hedonistic society where enjoyment is valued above all other things. What you actually find is when you have too much enjoyment, it destabilizes your life. It is not as enjoyable as you think. It's more of like an addiction that you can't quit, but you want it out of your life. And he thinks that the weakening of what he calls symbolic efficiency, and all this really translates is a sense of duty, a sense of I have to sacrifice enjoyment for social reasons, social protocols. We've all, because of consumerism and the individualism that it pushes, it's as if the greatest thing in life is us pursuing our enjoyment. And he's saying that in part this is actually why we're suffering so much, and why there may be so, you could even extend it, why there's so many mental illnesses, is because, and of course it's not all of them are reducible to this, but he's saying it's as if there's just the ego and our jouissance, and we form this kind of direct circuit between the shit that our ego finds enjoyable, and there's a lack of the symbolic. There's a lack of social protocols that actually helps us to better enjoy, better desire, and it's almost like we're too smothered in immediate enjoyment for our own good. And that's what he's getting at there, is that the law is there to actually help us have more meaningful and tolerable and stable coexistences between ourselves. And that kind of balance, as we all know, is very much lacking at this point in history.
This might be a good time to bring up one of the questions we had in chat a little bit ago. They were talking about pleasure principle and jouissance, and they're trying to situate the id and superego somehow in all of this. And I was like, my response in the chat was just like, it's kind of different, but I think it'll probably be beneficial just to differentiate like what those terms are.
No, I mean, we'll touch on that real fast, because I was planning on talking about superego. Here's one thing that's interesting about Lacan. He doesn't usually talk about the id, and out of all of Freud's concepts, it's interesting that he leaves id out of it. And I think here's what we can do. We can say that death drive or jouissance, they kind of fill the role of the way people use the term id, but there are sharp conceptual differences. And so, for example, if you see a Lacanian talk about id, chances are they're just talking about jouissance or death drive. But in the strict sense of the word, id has to do with a kind of cauldron inside of ourselves of these like animalistic impulses, like the repressed animality of us, right? And strictly speaking, I don't think Lacan thinks that even really exists. He certainly does something with superego, but he actually turns superego on its head, and it ends up being the opposite of the way the Freudian superego is thought of. Again, we're going to touch on that shortly. But yeah, it's interesting. Most Lacanians tend not to talk about id, and it's because they think that if id means like, okay, some kind of violent explosion of aggression or whatever, well then yes, certainly jouissance and death drive are capable of that. But it wouldn't be like, oh, it's just our repressed animality, like our just brute animalistic biological impulses. That's what it wouldn't be. So I think that's why Lacanians kind of dropped the usage of the word id. Okay. So just to clarify, we're talking about how law now is associated with the pleasure principle. And again, part of learning how all of this works is really just forming connections between words and concepts that you don't immediately realize are connected. And so, like the good, the rational, pleasure, self-interest, right? When you start to form this circuit of terms, you start to really be able to picture what pleasure is and the effects it's able to have.
Right.
Well, same thing goes on the other side with death drive and jouissance. So here in Seminar 7 again, Lacan says Freud's use of the good can be summed up in the notion that keeps us a long way from jouissance, right? So the good, what is in our self-interest, what is good for us, as we typically think about it, is to stay a long way from jouissance. And so you're starting to see how all of these key concepts that we use to think about what it is to be human, the good, the rational, pleasure, self-interest, they're all starting to be linked together on one side of our libidinal economy. And so again, in Seminar 7, Lacan will just say that jouissance is evil. But it's evil in the sense of how traditional religion or traditional morality would conceptualize the evil, which is to be completely self-destructive, to explode, right? To do all that is considered immoral. And yet, and here's the key thing we'll see below, death drive also has a deep connection to morality and a deep connection to religion in a certain sense. So it's not that it's actually evil in and of itself, but when you think of the kind of effects death drive can have, it makes sense that it would those kind of actions would be deemed evil, right? Because they destabilize society, they destabilize your relations to others, and destabilize your own well-being oftentimes. So there's a sense where it's like pleasure good, jouissance bad or evil, but that's like the basic way of looking at it in a real kind of white and black perspective. But in reality, it's much more nuanced, and sometimes death drive is actually our best friend and pleasure is our enemy. And we'll get into that again as we move along.
Let's just use like an example that comes to mind is like, let's just say that you're in a relationship that's not good, but like getting out of all the habits and attachments in that relationship would require like a pretty significant push. And so you might like end up being in that relationship for like a decade, right? Like you're not really happy, but at the same time, it's more of a balanced sort of comfort. Like at least you know what you're dealing with, as opposed to the scary outside world, and having to rely on complete strangers. At least you kind of have a read on, the person that you're in this relationship with is not ideal. Death drive. I'm just thinking of movies. There's sort of this archetypical breakup scene in movies when the person just explodes and they're done, and their whole mode for the next, part of the movie is death drive. Right? Like Absolutely. They're fucking throwing their bag. They don't even care if they leave half their shit in that house. They're fucking driving, 120 miles an hour, doing fucking, someone was talking about ODing on LSD. Yeah, who knows?
Well, here's what's complicated though. Let's flesh this out, because that's a good example and we all can relate to that in one way or another, right? So here's what's interesting about it. Pleasure and jouissance can be on either sides of this. So take the situation you're in that you're talking about, right? Let's say
I'm not in that relationship. I'm not. That's not a no.
No. I mean, in this theoretical scenario.
Yeah.
You were saying, right? You were putting yourself in this situation of like you're in this relationship and it's like, okay, I'm ready to move on. But the relationships are obviously incredibly complicated, and let's show how it can work in reverse, right? So let's say that you've been in a long-term relationship and you stay out of it because you have a basic it satisfies basic pleasures. There isn't a bunch of fighting or drama or stress or anything like that. It's just a kind of comfortable habit that you're in at this point. There isn't really a whole lot of passion in it, but it's a safety, a stability that you have in your life. And so in this sense, the relationship is the structure of your pleasure. right? It's your balance, your homeostasis, but it lacks excitation, it lacks passion. And so at some point you could go, well, it's precisely for my death drive, for jouissance, that I want out of this, because just pleasure in and of itself isn't really that great. And you could sit there and go, it's completely rational. I have what is called a good life. We trust each other. There's honesty in the relationship, and yet it just doesn't do it for you anymore. And so that's where it's like you have pleasure in the relationship, but you want something else. And so that's where it's like you start going down the path of death drive, and we all know it can start with, like, you know, he says, it starts with a tickle and ends with a blaze of petrol. When you want out of a relationship like that, especially a long-term one, it could just start by, oh, you know, you didn't call, or you didn't, you know, or you didn't show up, or what. It can start with these little acts of aggression, or little acts of like, you know what, I'm going to do something, and then it's actually going to lead to a fight, right? And so you can see how it starts to go in the other direction. But it can be reversed, where you're in a relationship and you can be hooked on it, and the relationship is completely toxic. All you two do is just scream and fight all the time. All it is this overabundance of stimulation. There is no calm or lack of excitation. It's pure jouissance, right? It's overstimulation. The fighting and the drama and all of that. And you could want out of it precisely because there's too much drama, too much jouissance, too much stimulation. And it's like the pleasure principles kicking in and going, God, don't you want some safety and stability and calm in your life? And so you could want to break up precisely for the sake of your pleasure in that scenario. So again, it depends on the parameters of the relationship, case by case.
Like Eminem and Rihanna's "Love the Way You Lie" music video, right? The whole
or Eminem and his relationship to Kim, right?
Oh shit, yeah. Yeah, I forgot about Kim. How could I? You know, I never forgot about Dre, but I forgot about Kim.
Right, and so that kind of just crazy love, that crazy erotic passion that can just be, you know, you're hooked on it, but it's also toxic and it throws your life into turmoil, right? That can be excessive jouissance. And again, the jouissance, it doesn't mean that it's in the actual act of sex. It can be in the act of fighting that you're hooked. That's where we all know that people repeat these unhealthy relationship patterns. And so the jouissance often isn't where you think it is. And so
you've been watching Barry, right? Did you watch the first 2 seasons of Barry?
Yeah, I love that show.
Yeah, that's like a friend of mine got me into it. I recommended it to you a little bit back. Now we both love it. We're waiting for the next season.
There's a character who wants some pleasure.
Sarah Goldberg she's like having so much trouble dealing with the fact that, like, she's basically like reinterpreted her past relationship to make herself into some kind of like she was like doing like she makes it out to be like, oh, she's the survivor, but like in reality, like when she actually like gets to the rock bottom of it and has to deal with it, spoiler alert everybody, I mean, it doesn't really matter, I don't think, it's kind of a side thing, but like it's like this moment of like awakening, like she was addicted to the toxicity of that relationship, and exactly. And she's shook. Yeah, and actually one of my favorite things about that show is her character arc after that point, because she's pretty fucking fake, like up until that point, and then she starts kind of rounding out a little bit more, becoming more of a person, you know.
But think about it. But see, I thought you were going to talk about Barry in the situation, which Bill Hader plays its character, and we know Bill Hader from certain comedies and from SNL. But my God, you see him in this role, and you have a whole newfound respect for his talent.
Oh my God, it's so good. His acting is wild. Well, and you know, like I was already about to talk about Breaking Bad because it's such a good example.
Well, yeah, and I mean, that's in my one blog post on jouissance. I use that as one of my big examples because Walt is really this embodiment of death drive and jouissance, right? But hold on, but here's the thing about Barry, right? You give the example of, what's the character's name again? Sarah Sarah
Yeah,
Goodman?
yeah. It's
Okay,
Goldberg.
so Sarah's
Yeah.
like hooked on Jouissance, right? And you see that this is part of what's toxic about the relationship she was in and all this. But Barry's the opposite. Like he wants some basic pleasure, right? He's had so much excitation in his life. He's just trying to get some basic stability, safety, security, pleasure, equilibrium, homeostasis. And so you see him trying to get the very opposite.
Right, because he's like he's a veteran, you know. He's got PTSD. He's like, it's like he is, and he's still like, and so he's basically an assassin or like a hitman, and that's what he does now. And he hates it. He's in a trap. He does not like how intense his life is, and he's always having these miserable flashbacks. And he gets involved with a theater community. Like it's all by accident, but then he finds like this is some normie shit. I like it.
He's had so much excessive excitation in his life. He's like, can I just have some simple everyday pleasure, just some calm, some stability? And so you see those two characters are opposite in this regard. So
Beach Bussy asks, is asceticism as a lifestyle a form of chasing the death drive?
So it's interesting it's all like whole books can be written on this, right? Because one of the things you'll find is that aesthetics are actually getting enjoyment, getting jouissance precisely from not enjoying. And so it's as if they're always making this libidinal sacrifice in being ascetics, and yet they enjoy the very loss itself. And so it's almost like, it looks like you're making these sacrifices, but you really have your compensation because you enjoy the act of sacrifice itself. And it's so I'm glad somebody brought that up, because we're going to talk about this as we move further down in the lecture. I had something to talk about. Todd McGowan especially highlights that death drive enjoys loss itself. That if there's an object to death drive, it's loss or sacrifice, losing, not getting, missing the object. But that's precisely the source of the jouissance. So it's a really weird dynamic. But the asceticism is really a form of actually being able to enjoy, right? It's like we only can enjoy when we're not really trying to enjoy. That's the whole problem that Zizek's always highlighting, that in our society, everywhere we go, the injunction is enjoy. Every restaurant, every place of entertainment, enjoy, enjoy, enjoy. And so at the unconscious level, this duty to enjoy becomes just that, a duty. Well, when we have this duty to constantly enjoy ourselves at all times, that itself extinguishes whatever enjoyment we have, because now whatever enjoyment we have a duty to enjoy more. And so it's this duty to enjoy that actually is driving all of us crazy. And again, in older times, right, there was a duty to not enjoy, to sacrifice. Thou shalt not enjoy was kind of, you think about the Victorian period, right? Even though, of course, they had their own different forms of enjoyment. The superego at that time seemed to prohibit in a much more robust, strong, affirmative way. And now we have this kind of permissive superego, but that's saying, oh, enjoy, enjoy, enjoy. But really, it's almost it's more lethal than telling us not to enjoy, because having the duty to enjoy, feeling like we're obligated to always be enjoying ourselves, and this is part of consumer-ism, as I'm going to talk about.
Let's not talk too much about your book. No, well, we could, but
No, that's not relevant here. It's just you see in consumer society, we all know it, that everywhere we go, the hidden message is always, whether it's implicit or explicit, it's always enjoy. And this kind of duty to enjoy ourselves really just drives us nuts and makes everything unenjoyable. It's this weird trick that is getting played on us at all times.
We interrupt this conversation for a quick message from our sponsors.
You may recognize this conversation from the past because it is actually a piece of a longer live stream. So what I've done is I've edited the conversations I had with Mikey down into smaller chunks, and I will be releasing those serially until the launch of the Slavoj Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do course, taught by Michael Downs and myself. I will be asking him the questions and hystericizing him, along with a cohort of people who will be joining us live and in the forums as we do a close reading of what Slavoj Žižek claims is his most important theoretical work, more important than Sublime Objective Ideology by far. He said that if you don't have anything to say about For They Know Not What They Do, then keep silent when it comes to Sublime Objective Ideology. But we don't just do close, thorough, hardcore readings. We also have some more introductory stuff. And so if you go to theory-underground.com/events, then you'll be able to see the dates of all of the upcoming events. You see that the Idea of University, taught by myself, Brian, and Ann, a couple of educators who are very close to me. And we wanted to focus on Karl Jasper's short work, The Idea of University, as a way to start the year, but it's also a way for Theory Underground to get off on the right track. January 25th is the Professional Managerial Class Consciousness course that I'm co-teaching with Elton LK of the Working Class Intelligentsia podcast. And then in February, on the 25th of February, launches Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do. Mikey has spent 2 decades getting himself to the point where he feels confident enough to teach this book. And I think that humility and effort that he's put in is something that we can all learn from. I mean, come on. He's like our own homegrown Žižek. He's like our own national treasure. I think that we really ought to uplift him and give credit where it's due, not just take him for granted and act like, we don't need to. So that's a part of the reason actually why I really appreciate Brian Becker from Singularity Sublimity podcast. He's done a lot of amazing teaching work himself. A lot of people read the blog and then don't give credit where it's due. And that would be fine if he had a cushy academic career with tenure and all that. But he doesn't. He's working in a warehouse, supporting his mom. We need to hashtag free Mikey from wage labor so that he can spend more time doing what his passion is, which is teaching philosophy and theory, writing books. That's what we want. More of these kinds of conversations. Make it possible. Make a donation. 5, 15, 20, 50, 100. Make the donation today. Please. It means a lot. Words are cheap. Money, now that's where it matters. Get your skin in the game. Show Mikey you care. I hope that we'll get to do a lot more of this in the near future. And then the last thing, I'm doing a countrywide tour this year. I will be on the East Coast, I will be on the West Coast, and I will be everywhere in between. So if you want me to come to your town or city, email me. It's down below. If you want to volunteer, be a part of the street team, host, or guide while we're there, let me know. I hope to be in a city near you sometime this year, and I hope that you'll take one of my classes. Thanks.